In this tutorial, we're going to be carrying on with part 2 of our natural looking outdoor portrait retouch step by step. Hi there, Michael Volshinovich here. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/vibrantshot. So in this second of a two-part series, we're just going to finish retouching our natural summer look outdoor portrait. Now in part 1, we looked at cleaning up shadows and making tonal changes with frequency separation, and then adding some contrast with dodging and burning, which basically got us from here to here. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, there is a link to it below this video, so I encourage you to check that out first. Now in this part, we're going to look at styling the photo a bit with a variety of tonal adjustments. We're going to add some bokeh and flaring, and we're also going to sharpen the image and work on details like the eyes and hair. So we're just going to go ahead and get started right where we left off, which is essentially with dodging and burning. But rather than dodging and burning more around the face, we're going to focus on dodging and burning some of the details. So, our highlights and our shadows within our hair. We're going to look at the eyebrows, eyes, and things like that. So we're going to go ahead and get started by creating another group. We're just going to call this DB Details. And I'm going to create a new layer in here. Again, it's going to be a curves adjustment. We're going to push this up quite aggressively. We wouldn't go this high if we were just doing the dodging and burning within the skin, but when you're doing the details, you can go up quite a bit more drastically. So we're going to change that to luminosity blend mode, just like we did with our regular dodge and burn, because again, we don't want it to change the color, we just want it to affect the luminosity value. We'll call that dodge, and we're going to select our mask and hit Command I or Control I. That's just going to disable that for us. Then we're going to add our next curves adjustment, which is going to be our burn layer, and we're just going to drag the midpoint down here. And again, we're going to do the same thing, change to luminosity blend mode. I'm going to call this burn, select our mask, and hit Command I. So now we're basically ready to get started. What I'm going to do is, again, we're going to use a Wacom tablet for this because we're going to be working with some of these finer details here, and it just makes it a lot easier to do. And where I would typically use maybe a 5% opacity when I'm dodging and burning around the skin, with details you can go up to about 10 or 15%. It just saves you going back and forth over the same spot so many times. You can just simply be much more aggressive in your dodging and burning here. So we're going to start with our dodging. I'm going to basically work on the hair highlights here. So we've got our opacity set, we've got our white selected as our foreground color, and we're just going to kind of go over some of these highlight areas. And again, we're going to be sort of building this up as we go, so don't worry about getting it all in one pass. And again, the goal here is to just create depth within the hair. So basically wherever there's natural highlights in the hair, that's really where I'm going over. So this is much easier than the skin dodging and burning, because that one is kind of, more just a matter of practice. You really just have to know where you should go over with dodging and burning, whereas here you just kind of follow the natural lines of the hair. Wherever there's highlights, you dodge, and wherever there's a bit of darker areas, you just burn those areas. So I think that's a pretty good starting point for our dodging within here. And we're going to move on to burning, and then we'll just see where we're at. Usually what I'll do is I'll go back and forth, and then I'll kind of vary my brush size as I go through. So I may come back, do another pass with a smaller brush size, just to make sure it doesn't look like we're sort of dodging and burning with the same size throughout. It doesn't look fake. On this side, we don't have to do too much burning because the hair is already pretty dark, because this is our shadow side here. So now I'm going to go up with my brush size a little bit, just using my my square bracket keys for that. And now we're going to go down in size as well. We're going to look at some of these smaller sections of shadowing here. I always tend to burn in the center here, just wherever the hair part is. And again, the Wacom tablet just allows you to make a lot more natural strokes than you're capable of doing with a mouse. So again, I highly recommend it if you're going to do a lot of portrait retouching. It will drive you crazy the first week you use it, but after that you'll wonder how you ever lived without it. Okay, so I think we're getting pretty good there. Let's just see where we're at. So as you can see, just as we kind of toggle that on and off, this looked okay, but then now if we look at this, we see we've created a lot more sort of layering and depth within the hair. So we get this more three-dimensional effect than we had before. So I'm just going to go over and finish up with some dodging, again using a smaller pen size. So we're going to go a little bit more fine-grained here in some of these areas. And when you're doing this, one thing you can also do is hit the R key and then just rotate your image. So if you find that your stroke, is easier to make, for example, right here, it's easier to go across for me than it is to go sort of up and down. So I'm just going to rotate this out, and even more so for these ones. And we're just going to go sort of around here. When you're working with a large brush size, it really doesn't matter, but once you sort of get to this point here, let's just turn that on. So that would definitely help. Luckily for me, I kind of know where I should be painting, so we just didn't see the effect here, but as we toggle that on and off, there we go, we actually had it disabled. So I think that's pretty good on that side. Let's just finish up with this side here. So I'm just going to rotate it this way, and we're just going to make a few passes here. And again, the reason we want to use a small brush size is we just want to make sure it looks natural. If the patches of dodging and burning are too big, then obviously it'll just look a little bit fake because hair strands are fairly fine. Now, if you're rotating back, you can always hit the Shift key and it will jump in these sort of increments as we hold Shift, so it's very easy to get back to a proper orientation. So I think we're pretty good there with our dodging and burning for the hair. So let's just move on and quickly deal with the eyebrows and eyelashes. So we're going to select burn. We're going to keep it at 10%. And I may actually rotate this a little bit just to make it easier for me. And again, we're just going to make some short strokes through here. I just always find that it looks a little bit better if the eyebrows are a little bit darker. Now, obviously, if you've got a blonde person, then you may not want to do this. But with anybody with sort of a brunette hair, it just looks pretty good. So now we're just going to go around the eyes here, and again, I'm just kind of darkening this up a tiny bit, just making some short strokes here. And again, we're going to sort of mix it up with larger and smaller brush sizes. And we're going to do the same thing on this side. I'm just going to rotate it back a little bit for it to make it a little easier for me to work. And again, as you do this, it may not seem like you're doing much. It's not having much effect, but when you actually go back and toggle on and off, we see that it does make a significant difference. So you don't want to overdo that. Again, you just want to keep that fairly subtle, but you just have to kind of stop where you are, toggle on and off, and just see if it looks pretty good. And as with anything, check it out at higher zoom lengths, closer zoom lengths. Just to make sure it looks good in lots of different ways. So the next thing I want to do is just bring out some of the detail in the eyes here. So we're not really necessarily dodging and burning. It's maybe a very selective dodging and burning. But what I may actually do is I'm actually going to leave that step for now. What I tend to do is dodge inside the actual iris as well, but I'm going to leave that as our next step. We're just going to create a new curves adjustment here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick our elliptical marquee tool. And what I do is I start from, just in and around the center of the pupil here, and just hold down Option, which is going to allow us to make this selection going from the center. And just make a rough selection like that. I'm actually going to shift over to this side a little bit. Just have to find a good center point to go off of. And then we're just going to kind of use our keys to shift this into position. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that we've got this exclusion or subtraction mode selected for our selection tool. And we're going to start somewhere high above where we started originally. And again, we're going to hold Option, and we're going to create this sort of selection. So now we've created this sort of crescent moon shape. Then we're going to hit Refine Edge, and we're going to just feather this up to, well, in and around there, let's say 6-7 pixels. You do want to keep that fairly soft. And now we're going to create a new curves adjustment. You can use curves or exposure adjustment, or filters I should say here. Whatever works best for you. I tend to use the curves, and just to add a little bit of light under the eye there. So if we toggle that on and off, we see that does brighten the eyes quite a bit, and we're going to probably adjust the opacity of that too, because we don't want it to look overly bright, and to do that you really have to zoom out. So let's just finish up with the other eye here. This one I'm probably not going to brighten as much, simply because this one is on the light side, this one's in the shadow side, so we're going to just bring in a little bit of light there. And I think because there's such a variance, if this was sort of straight on lighting, I would actually make the adjustment on the same layer. But because we've got a bright one and a darker one here, I'm going to create separate adjustment layers so I can control their opacities separately. So again, we're going to take the same process here. We're going to make a selection around the eye here using the elliptical tool. Hit Option to start from the center. Start up high here. And actually I'm going to undo that. I want to start maybe a little bit over from this side. Sometimes this takes a few tries. Before you get it right, you just have to kind of experiment and see where you're going to get the shape you're after. And as we can see, I'm having trouble doing that. Let's just try something like this. And we'll just get rid of this as well. The reason I wanted a shape like this, and we're going to probably refine this a little bit with our brush, is because the light is coming from this angle. The light should be kind of, brightening up over here. We don't really want too much brightness on this side. So just to kind of match the light angle coming through. One thing I may do, actually, if we right-click this here, we can transform our selection. And then if we hold the Shift key down, this will just kind of make sure we transform it uniformly. I'm just going to shrink this down a little bit, and then use my keys to position it into place. I think the selection I made originally was a little too big. Hit Enter to apply that, and again I'm just going to use my keys to shift it, and then we're going to use Refine Edge. Once again we're going to feather it to around maybe 6 or 7 pixels. Create a new curves adjustment. And just bring in a little bit of light there. Now we're going to group those two together into a layer we'll call Eyes. So let's just zoom out and let's see if we want to adjust the opacities of these layers. And I think I do. This does look a little bit too bright and overdone for me. So I'm going to just kind of drop this one down, just make sure that that's the right eye. Yep. So let's take that down to around 50. Let's see how we're doing. I think that's a good starting point. And then with this one here, let's just take that down to around 50% as well. I think that's enough as well. And again, it's just a matter of brightening it a little bit to bring more attention into the eyes. Now the next thing I'm going to do is go in here, and we're going to just play out this catch light a little bit. So I'm going to create a new blank layer here. We're going to pick a brush. We're going to make the hardness of that brush probably around 50%. And then we're going to shrink it down a fair bit. We're going to change our blend mode here to screen. And I'm just going to, again, rotate my image a bit. And I'm just going to, where we have these little catch lights, I want to even have a smaller brush than that. Just going to brush in a tiny bit. And this is probably going to be way too bright, so we're actually going to take care of that in a moment. So let's just hold spacebar. Let's go into this eye here. Just 2 little dabs. Just lower the opacity a little bit. All right, and now rotating back. Let's zoom out. So we can see that, that just punches up that catch light a little bit more. Now in studio, usually that's not a problem. The strobe light always gives you a nice catch light. But when we're working with natural light outside, it's a little bit more difficult to get one. So that's still a little bit too bright for me, so I'm just going to lower that down to maybe around 75%. And again, it's just a little pop of light that we want in the eye to draw attention. So let's see where we've come so far. We've got, let's just move these 2 curves adjustments into here. So we've got our eyes that have gone from here to here, and we've got our hair dodging and burning, and our eyebrows, eyelashes from here to here. So last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into, I'm probably going to keep it in my eye layer. You can either use your dodge layer or just go right into the eye layer itself. And I'm just going to create one more curves adjustment, and that's going to be one that brightens. Again, we're going to change this to a luminosity blend mode here. We could have done that with these eye ones as well, but because the effect isn't terribly large, we don't have to worry about that. So let's just invert this. We're going to zoom back in, and I'm just going to work on a couple of these little inner eye details here. So because I already have my brush set up correctly, I've got a very small brush size, and it's at 50% hardness. I can just work right off of that. So I'm just going to rotate my image this way just to make it a little bit easier to work with. And we're just going to, wherever there's little bits of brightness inside the eye, and you can burn this as well, but I typically just create a couple of little dodge lines to add more detail into the eye. Let's just make sure that that's actually having some effect. Very subtle, as you can see, but it is doing something. Sometimes I'll actually burn around the iris, but in this case, naturally she has a nice dark circle around here, so we don't have to do that. And then let's just quickly take a look at this eye. Again, with this one, we're going to be fairly careful not to overdo it because it is in the shadow, so we don't want it to look like we really faked this. So if we just toggle that on and off, it's really a subtle effect, but it's it's those little details that that tend to take your images to the next level. So now the next place we're going to move on to is going to be to sharpen our image, and there's a couple of different ways you can do it inside of Photoshop CC, the new version of Photoshop through Creative Cloud. Their Smart Sharpen tools are actually pretty good, so I have used those, and they work fairly well. But the way I typically do it is to use high pass sharpening. So with high pass sharpening, the first thing that we have to do is to actually create a stamp visible layer of our image, or essentially we need a duplicate layer. So what I don't want to create a stamp visible layer because essentially it will take out all of these adjustment layers for us and it will cover them, and we want to be able to adjust those a little bit later if we need to. So I'm actually going to sharpen on this stamp visible layer that we have down here below. Now it doesn't really matter what order you do the sharpening, and you can do it a lot earlier than we're doing it here, but that's just kind of the order I like to take. So we're just going to duplicate this layer here. And now, thanks to Natalia Taffarel, who also has a bunch of great retouching videos, so definitely look her up. She revealed some interesting details about the high pass filter that Photoshop uses, and essentially what it does is it doesn't take into account sort of the dark shadows and the very light highlights. It actually just kind of focuses more on the middle portion of the histogram. So in order to actually have it operate on the entire image, what we need to do is we need to take out some of the contrast in the image. And so thanks to her again for providing this technique, and it does work a lot better than just naively applying high pass to the layer itself. So we're going into image adjustments, and then we selected brightness contrast, and we're just going to take contrast all the way down to -50, and then we're going to go into filter, other, high pass, and I typically tend to sharpen portraits anywhere from 1 pixel radius to 2 pixels, and that again depends on the resolution of your image. So with a high resolution image, you can go higher on the radius. With a lower resolution image, go lower on the radius. So in this case, I'm going to pick something more or less in the middle here at around 1.4. And here we can see all of the dodging and burning essentially that we've done. So we're going to select vivid light as our blend mode. You can do linear light as well. It's a bit more of an intense sharpening. I find that vivid light tends to produce a little bit less artifacts and it's a little more subtle. So that's usually what I'll go with. Now, if we zoom in here and we actually compare before and after, we see that we do bring in quite a bit of sharpness. Now, a couple of things. Obviously, this is a very shallow depth of field portrait, so we don't want to sharpen everywhere. In a studio portrait, you'd probably want to apply that more or less globally because you might be shooting at f11, f16, whereas here we shot this, I think, at around f1.8. So I can essentially take out the sharpening in this background portion and some of this lower hair here because it's already blurry anyways. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opacity down. I usually start with around 50%. I rarely, if ever, leave this at 100%. And again, we can just kind of verify that by making sure that we're not creating too many artifacts around the eyes. And I think that's okay. Basically, it's where I tend to check it is around the eyes. I want to make sure that here it doesn't look really kind of grainy and ugly. And right now it still feels a little too sharp for me. So I'll take it down to around 30% actually. And that's usually where I end up is in the range of 30 to 40%. And I think that just gives a nice little boost of sharpness without overdoing it. Like, you don't need your portraits to be super sharp. And just to be on the safe side here, I am going to take it out of these background portions. So I'm just going to hold down Option, add a layer mask. We're going to select a nice big brush. Let's just make the softness a lot higher. And we're going to take our opacity up to 100. Essentially, we just want to take it right out of these areas. So I'm just going to brush it right out. Same with down here in the hair. It's all blurred out anyway, so there's no reason to apply sharpening to it and degrade our image quality. Down here as well. Basically, we're just kind of concentrating it on the main area. So we're sharpening kind of the eyes, the lips a little bit, and bring out some of the freckles in areas where they're sharp. Okay, so I think that's pretty good for our sharpening. So now that we've got that, we can just label that sharpen. And it is a good idea to label all of your layers. I'm just going to call this vignette. Because, as you work through some of these images, the number of layers can grow quite large, so it just helps to keep you organized. And if you are delivering this image to a client, if you're an actual retoucher, they do like to see all of those layers nicely labeled so they can pull things off, turn them on, and just see if there's something maybe they don't want to use. So now the next area we're going to move on to is the actual toning of the image. So we're going to adjust our colors to make it look a little bit nicer. So to start with that, I'm going to create again another group here called toning because we are going to make a number of adjustments here. And with toning, again, I have a video called Mastering Color Adjustments, and I do recommend that you watch that video just because it'll go into a lot more detail and a couple of different techniques that we won't cover here. Here I'll probably be using maybe 2 different techniques, 3 different techniques. There I'll probably cover closer to 6 different ways to add different tones to your image. So I do highly recommend watching that after you finish this video, if you haven't already done so. So the first thing I usually start off with when I'm toning my image is I'll usually go into Selective Color. And typically I'll work on the whites and the blacks, and then I'll kind of boost that up using curves as well. So I'm going to start with blacks, and oftentimes I like to take away some of the yellow in the blacks just to kind of give a little bit of a blue tint into the blacks. So we'll do that at -5. Then we'll go into our whites, and we will play with this color a little bit. So in the case of whites, what we can basically do is introduce some additional color into areas that are just pure white, and that usually works nicely with a portrait. Maybe we want to add a little bit of yellow. As you can see, that kind of just adjusts this area of highlights on the face. So we're just going to bring that up a tiny bit. And we can play with these, cyan colors or whatever. In this case, I don't want to go in this direction. I do want to keep it looking fairly warm. So I'm probably going to leave that. And then we can also experiment with the black just to see how much we want to bring out highlights as well. So if we wanted a really aggressive highlight, we could just take that down. As you can see, it really punches up that highlight. So I'm just going to take it a little bit over here to -5 or so. Now I may do a curves adjustment. Let's just see how that's going to look. If we go into curves and we go into our blue channel here, if we drag down on the highlight side, that's going to again introduce more yellow into our highlights. So I may take that down a tiny bit. And if we drag up here, it's going to again introduce a little bit more blue into our shadows. And that's doing pretty much the same thing we did with selective color, but it's a little bit more intense, so I just like to kind of do those as two separate layers. Now, what I think I want to do is again kind of work on the color of our shadows and our highlights. So I'm going to add a brand new layer, and we're going to fill this layer with a color. So let's just start off by sampling some of the skin tone here. That's going to give us this sort of creamy color. I think I want to make that color something like that. And then we can adjust this color later as well. I'm just kind of getting a starting point. So I'm going to hit Option Delete. That's going to fill with our foreground color. And this color already looks a little bit too pink to me. So you know what, I may just do the adjustment right away here. Just going to bring this up a tiny bit. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take away some of the redness of the skin tone, so I want to make sure that doesn't look too pinkish here. So again, we're Option Delete that, and we can see that that looks a little bit more taupey in color. Now I'm going to change this to color blend mode. And again, I do go through this technique in quite a bit of detail in that mastering color adjustments video. So if there's anything you miss here, you may want to go to that video to get a better idea of what I'm doing. Then we're going to add a layer mask. And I'm actually going to disable this layer. We're going to go to Image, Apply Image. And we're going to just make sure Merge to select. Blending mode should be Multiply. We're not going to invert it. That's all we need to set. Click OK. I'm going to turn that back on, and now as we can see, that adjustment is being applied only to our highlights. Well, not necessarily, entirely. It's just not really applying into the deepest shadows. But if we just look at our mask, if we just hold Option and click on the mask, we can see that these are the areas where that color is being let through. So in these deep shadow areas, it's not letting that through. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hit Option again. Let's just get us back to this point. And essentially we just added this warmer sort of cast to it. Now there's a couple of things we can do here. We can try and refine that mask a little bit. If we hit Command L, we can either drag this way to essentially extend the reach of that color. As you can see, the layer mask itself here is becoming much lighter. Or we can go in this direction, and that's going to sort of tighten the area that we're covering here, and that's really what I want to do. I want to restrict it to just the brighter highlights. So I'm going to go around there at 0.9, and if we hold Option again, we see that we have darkened this mask quite a bit. So now it's really just coming through the brightest areas. And I'm actually going to select a black color and have my brush selected. I'm going to pick a lower opacity here at around 10% or so, and we're just going to brush it out of the back here because I don't necessarily want to cover this green color up. I do want it to more or less stay the way it is. And I'll brush a little bit out of the hair too, because I don't want the hair taking on this color too much either. I really just want that applied primarily to our skin tones. Next thing we can do is we can try and work on our shadows here. I don't know if we really need to. This might be pretty close. Now one other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I pull this this yellow or taupey tint out of the eyes, because we want to keep our eyes looking fairly white. So I'm going to shrink down our brush size. I'm going to zoom in a bit here, and I'm going to bring up my opacity. I'm just going to make sure that that's not going into the eyes, because the eyes should be white. There we go. Now I still think that this opacity is too high, so I'm actually going to take that down to around 60% or so. I think that looks pretty nice. So again, all we've done here is taken out some of this redness out of the skin tone, and which I don't really like to see too much red in my skin tones, so this just kind of takes care of that. Gives us a nice warm, pleasing color. So I'm going to try and work on the shadows a little bit here, and we'll see how that looks. Maybe we won't even use it. So click new layer there, and we'll start with our base color, the exact same color that we actually had when we worked on our highlights, but we're just going to drag this way down and pick a dark brown color. Again, we're going to Option Delete to fill that with our foreground color, or in the case of a PC, you just hit Alt Delete. We're going to add a layer mask. We're going to change this to color blend mode. And obviously this isn't looking terribly good right now. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to again go into Image, Apply Image. I'm just going to disable that. But this time we're going to select Invert, which basically is going to give us the opposite effect, so it's going to operate on shadows rather than highlights. We're going to turn that back on, and we see that, you know, these highlights here, they didn't really take on that color tone. Now with shadows, we're going to drop this way down in opacity, maybe to around 25%. And so essentially what we've really done here is we've kind of desaturated the image quite drastically. And again, I'm going to hit Command L so that I can adjust this layer mask a little bit. One thing we can do is just have that layer mask visible here, and then we're going to hit Command L with, of course, our layer mask selected. And we're just going to make it so that, you know, the highlights again don't come through. We want to just apply that to areas where it's the deepest shadow. So because we inverted it, now we're working on shadows. We want the shadows to be white here. Something like that should be pretty good. And there we go. As you can see, it's now affecting just these shadow areas here. Now what I'm going to basically do is I'm going to right click on this mask here, and I'm going to say Apply Layer Mask, and I'm going to add a new layer mask on top of that. But before I do that, I'm going to hold down Option, and I'm going to add it in. And now really what I want to do is, I do like some of this blue tinting in the shadows, but I don't like it around the face. So I'm just going to use a nice soft brush at a low opacity, maybe around 10%. Let's make sure that we're at hardness 0. We're going to make sure that white is our brush color, so just hit X to swap these two. And then we're going to just paint in where the skin is. So areas of shadow, of course, in the skin, because in these highlights we don't really need to paint it in because that original mask wouldn't have actually added any sort of effect there. Basically, I'm doing this because we use this curve here to add some blue tinting into the blacks. I don't really want to see any blue tones in my skin. I just want them to be nice and organic, sort of browns and taupe colors here. And then we're going to do the same thing around the neck and under the chin. So now this effect, as you can see, it's really subtle. You may not even notice it too much, but and it's up to you whether you want to go this far with something like this. We can, if we bring this up to 100%, if I actually toggle this on and off, you will see the difference that, you know, we're applying a more natural color to here. And you may want to actually do it at 100% just to make sure you've covered off all the areas of shadow on the skin, and then just take it right back down at the end. So I'm probably going to stick with around 25% there. So that in effect is our toning. So let's just see what kind of difference that makes. That just kind of takes it from, you know, feeling like it's out of the camera to, you know, just being a little bit more interesting. So with that out of the way, the next thing we can move on to is to style our image a little bit. And we do that by adding a little bit of bokeh. I typically don't like to do this too much with studio shots because it doesn't really feel very natural with studio shots, but with outdoor portraits it can really make them look nice and a little bit more interesting. So it's up to you whether you like this look or not. If you don't, then basically, you know, we're pretty much done with this image. But if you do, then stick around and let's cover that topic. So to apply our bokeh, the first thing we need, of course, is a bokeh texture, and you can either get those online, just buy a bokeh texture pack for about $5 to $10, or you can go out and simply shoot them at night. So just find some light sources, defocus your lens, and fire away. So once you actually have your textures in place, then in this case I'm going to select 3 textures that I'm going to use to kind of fill in some of the background over here and over here, and I'm also going to apply some in this front portion as well. So I picked 3 textures, and again, there's really no scientific process to picking them, just something that has a good concentration of the bokeh dots that I can use to fill in here, and I'm not really worried about position or how blurry they are because we can change all of that as we bring it in. So first thing I'm going to do is just create a new group called Bokeh. And then I'm going to bring in this texture over here. So we're just going to use our move tool to drag it in. And then I'm going to change the blend mode to screen. Then we're going to hit Command T to transform this. So the first thing I'm going to do is just shrink this down so that the size of the actual bokeh kind of matches what we have in our background. Then I'm going to rotate this. No, that's not what I want. I want to rotate it. I'm going to hold Shift just to kind of do this rotation incrementally. And then I am going to flip it horizontally. And then we're just going to drag that into place. So I think that positions pretty nicely. Now I'm going to hit Command U to change the color of this a little bit. So I want to introduce a little bit more of a green color to this. I want to take lightness down, and I want to take saturation of that down as well, because we don't have terribly saturated colors back here. Maybe to around 55. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to convert this for smart filters. And basically that's just going to allow me to apply a blur to this and not really commit myself to the amount of blur that I'm applying, so I can always change it down the road. So I'm going to go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we're going to pick a radius of around 30 to 35 here, just something that will match what we have in our background. So let's just see how that looks. I think that's pretty good. So we'll apply that, and of course again we can change that down the road if we decide we're not terribly happy with it. So I'm going to take the opacity down on that as well to around maybe 65%. And then we're going to add a mask there. So just add a white mask. We're going to grab our brush, and the flow rate, we're actually going to use opacity instead of, we're going to use flow instead of opacity. So when we're doing the dodging and burning, we used opacity, but now we actually want to use flow. And the reason for that is that if we just create a new layer here and we fill it with black, and we have flow, if we start kind of painting through here, you see that eventually as I paint, I get to white. But if I use opacity instead, so we keep flow rate at 100%, we just lower down opacity, and we start painting, we never quite get to white. I have to keep clicking and sort of adding. If I just hold my pen down continuously and paint, I'll never get there. So I just have to keep raising my pen and going and going. And as you can see, it's very difficult to get to the actual white color that we selected. So when I'm working with masks, I tend to work with flow as opposed to opacity. So let's take opacity back up, and we'll take our flow down. And now what I basically just want to do is blend this a little bit better, because there's a little too much of it and it's kind of encroaching on the hair and everything here. So we're just going to paint it out of these areas here. Just get rid of it in some places entirely. And let's just see where we have some of the original bokeh. Maybe I'll get rid of it up here. And so the idea again is just to kind of make it show up a little bit. Now we can always reposition this as well if we decide that we do want to have a little bit more come in here. We can do that, maybe something like that. Just kind of finding what works. So sometimes you want to just reposition this later to find an ideal position. I think maybe even like that will be better. So let's just continue to mask that out. I think that will work okay. And to be honest, I think I do want to blur that a little bit more. I don't think it's quite blurry enough, considering how blurry the other ones are. So we're probably going to go up to somewhere around 38 instead. So that's just kind of filling in that spot for us a little bit. Now we're going to work on this side over here. So we're going to grab this texture. Let's just move that in. Again, same process. I'm going to drop it in here. We're going to change it to screen blend mode. Nope, not color dodge. Screen. And let's rotate this. So again, hitting Command T. And we're just going to shrink that. And let's just kind of play around and see where we're going to position this. So I think probably something like that will look pretty good. We're just going to shrink this down a little bit as well. I think that will be quite fine. So again, we're just going to apply that transform. Then we're going to hit Command U, change our color a little bit. Okay, I'm going to drop down our opacity. We're going to filter convert for smart filters. And then we're going to apply the Gaussian blur. So again, maybe a 38, 30. In this case, we're actually going to apply a little bit less. Okay, and then finally, one more time, we're just going to add our layer mask and brush it out of the areas we don't want to see it. So let's just see where we want to retain the original bokeh texture. I'm going to actually keep this area, which is part of the original bokeh. There's some coming into here. And one thing again you want to maybe do is just hold down Option to make sure that you're kind of covering off all the areas where the face is, because in this case I don't want to apply it to where the face is. And I might want to make this one a little bit more faint, so I'm just going to kind of brush over that and just brush over this one. I think that's okay. Alright, and so the last thing we're going to do is bring in this texture here. So let's just drag that in. Now in this case, I'm going to rotate this way, and then I'm going to flip it horizontally. And I actually do want to keep this texture fairly large. So maybe something like that. And again, screen blend mode. There we go. Just like that. And then same process goes. I'm going to just apply that transformation. This is probably getting pretty boring, but convert for smart filters. And this one we're going to blur a little bit less than the other ones as well. Probably around 13, 15 should be pretty good. Maybe even a tiny bit less. Alright, and again, adding a layer mask, grabbing our brush, color, the black color selected. I'm going to actually lower the flow on this one a fair bit. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure to get rid of it from the face itself. So we don't want it there. We're just going to kind of smooth these edges. Just going to kind of pull that one out there. I find it's a little too bright. Same with this here. Just again making sure it's not anywhere where the face is. I'm going to maybe pull it out where I have some of the shadows in here, because I just don't want to lose some of the contrast that we have in here. just going to soften this little flare here. So that's basically giving us this sort of effect. And actually I do want to paint back a little bit over here just to make it seem as though it's not, too perfect, right? That we didn't perfectly mask out the face. So that I just use white to just bring some of that mask back in. So now if we collapse this group here and we toggle this on and off, we see that basically this creates this sort of effect. And I'm not entirely happy with this over here. I think I would probably mask this out just a little bit more. And I may reposition that texture, but I don't really want to bore you with that. I think that this yellow is a little too intense, so I may even pick a different bokeh texture to use for that. But you get the idea that, essentially just kind of position the bokeh into place so that it looks good. And in this case, I just got a little 2-for-1 with this front one, because not only did I add a little bit of bokeh to the front, it added this sort of haze effect, and this looks like a little bit of a lens flare. So lots of different things came in all at the same time, and all just from this one simple bokeh texture. So just kind of repositioning it, blending it as screen blend mode, and getting to that point. So if we just create a new group here to put together all of the different pieces that we essentially created today, I'm just going to call this group part 2. Not just part 2. There we go. And we're going to drag in all of the groups and layers that we essentially made here, and we toggle that on and off. We see that we've gone from this sort of image that still retains sort of the in-camera colors, but we've smoothed out the tonal gradations in the skin. We've added some extra depth using a dodging and burning to an image that is just a lot more polished, a lot more interesting, and has, I think, a little bit more character. So if this bokeh texture application is just not for you, you don't like that look, if we turn this off and just toggle back and forth, again we see that we made a number of small changes, but all those changes sort of add up to create, again, a much more refined and nice looking image. So hopefully you found both parts of this tutorial helpful, and they'll help you in your portrait retouching going forward. So until next time, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below, and also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/vibrantshot. Bye for now.